For years, Venezuela has stood as one of the clearest examples of how a nation rich in natural resources can descend into political collapse, economic devastation, and social breakdown. Once among the world's largest oil producers, the country entered the second decade of the 21st century, facing a crisis that touched every part of daily life. Food shortages, failing hospitals, mass migration, and an increasingly authoritarian state centered around President Nicolás Maduro. By the mid-2000s, Venezuela was no longer experiencing a temporary downturn. It was undergoing a systemic collapse. The legislative branch was stripped of real power. The Supreme Court was openly aligned with the executive. Protests were met with violent repression, and opposition figures were persecuted, jailed, or forced into exile. International human rights organizations repeatedly warned that Venezuela was abandoning democratic norms and violating basic principles of international law. It was in this environment that an unlikely figure emerged. A man who would become one of the most polarizing symbols of modern Venezuelan history, Oscar Alberto Pérez. Pérez was not a career politician. He was a police investigator, a helicopter pilot, a tactical officer, and, unexpectedly, an actor. Born in Caracas in 1981, he grew up in a middle-class neighborhood and joined Venezuela's investigative police force, the CICPC, at a young age. For most of his career, he avoided public political activism. Colleagues described him as disciplined, charismatic, and deeply committed to humanitarian causes. But as Venezuela's crisis deepened, Pérez became increasingly vocal about what he described as the moral collapse of the state. He spoke of children who no longer dreamed of education, but of crime, of hospitals without medicine, of a society where fear had replaced opportunity. To many Venezuelans, these were not abstract ideas. They were daily realities. In 2015, Pérez starred in the film Muerte Suspendida, playing an elite police officer leading high-risk aerial operations. The film was intended to boost morale within the security forces and became a major box office success in Venezuela. At the time, few imagined that fiction would soon merge with reality in such a dramatic way. On June 27, 2017, during nationwide protests against the Maduro government, a helicopter appeared over Caracas. Piloted by Oscar Pérez, it hovered above key government buildings, including the Supreme Tribunal of Justice. A banner reading 350 Liberty hung from its side, a reference to Article 350 of Venezuela's Constitution, which states that citizens have the right to reject any regime that violates democratic values or human rights. Shots were fired, explosive devices were dropped. No one was killed. Later, Pérez would insist the operation was designed to avoid casualties. Still, the message was unmistakable. The Venezuelan government immediately labeled the act terrorism. Supporters of the opposition saw something very different, a bold act of resistance against what they viewed as an illegitimate and authoritarian regime. From that moment on, Pérez became both a fugitive and a symbol. The government plastered his face across Caracas on wanted posters, branding him a terrorist and accusing him of working with foreign intelligence agencies, including the CIA. Pérez, meanwhile, turned to social media, speaking directly to the public and bypassing state-controlled media entirely. In a series of videos, he described himself as part of a small coalition of military personnel, police officers, and civilians. He insisted his fight was not against Venezuela itself, but against tyranny. His language echoed themes familiar to Western audiences: freedom, constitutional order, individual rights, and the moral obligation to resist authoritarian power. Despite commanding only a small group, Pérez managed to evade capture for months. In December 2017, his group carried out a surprise raid on a National Guard outpost, seizing weapons without bloodshed. Each action reinforced his image as a lone insurgent, technologically savvy, media-aware, and openly defiant of a heavily armed state. The final chapter came in January 2018 in El Junquito, on the outskirts of Caracas. Venezuelan security forces surrounded the house where Pérez and his group were hiding. What followed was not only a military operation, but a live broadcast event. Bloodied and exhausted, Pérez appeared in videos posted online, repeatedly stating that he wanted to surrender. He accused government forces of continuing to fire despite his attempts to negotiate. Hours later, the operation ended with 7 members of his group dead. Authorities claimed it was a counter-terrorism success. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, raised serious concerns, citing evidence consistent with extrajudicial execution. Death certificates later showed that several of the deceased, including Pérez himself, had been shot in the head. To many observers, the case became emblematic of how the Venezuelan state handled dissent: overwhelming force, minimal transparency, and no independent investigation. Inside Venezuela, reactions were sharply divided. Some praised the elimination of what the government called a terrorist threat. Others mourned Pérez as a martyr. Hashtags calling him a hero trended internationally. Opposition leaders, foreign politicians, and human rights advocates condemned the operation and demanded accountability. But Oscar Pérez was never the cause of Venezuela's collapse. He was a symptom of it. The deeper tragedy was the country itself. Despite enormous oil reserves, Venezuela's economy had imploded. Hyperinflation destroyed salaries. Grocery shelves were empty. Hospitals lacked basic supplies. Children suffered from malnutrition. Millions fled the country, creating one of the largest migration crises in modern history. President Nicolás Maduro consistently blamed external forces, especially the United States, accusing Washington of waging an economic war through sanctions and political pressure. The U.S., in turn, framed its actions as support for democracy, human rights, and regional stability, values deeply rooted in Western political tradition. This tension between sovereignty and intervention, between authoritarian resilience and international pressure, defined Venezuela's position on the global stage for years. Then on January 3, 2026, the unthinkable happened. Nicolás Maduro was captured by U.S. forces during a military operation, an event many Venezuelans and international observers described as a decisive step toward restoring freedom, democracy, and hope for the Venezuelan people. Reactions across Latin America were immediate and deeply divided. Some leaders condemned the move as a violation of sovereignty. Others remained cautious. A few openly celebrated what they saw as the end of an era. For many Venezuelans, Maduro's arrest reopened old questions. Was this long-delayed justice or a dangerous precedent? Did it validate those like Oscar Pérez, who argued that peaceful change was no longer possible? Or did it confirm fears that Venezuela's fate would ultimately be decided by external powers? What is undeniable is that Pérez's story gained new relevance overnight. A man once dismissed as a rogue actor was re-examined as part of a broader narrative of resistance, desperation, and moral conflict in a nation pushed to its limits. Oscar Pérez did not overthrow a government. He did not command an army. He did not live to see political change. But with a small group, a helicopter, and a camera phone, he forced the world to look directly at Venezuela's collapse and confront uncomfortable questions about power, legitimacy, and the cost of silence. His legacy remains contested: hero or terrorist, rebel or fanatic, patriot or criminal. These labels depend largely on perspective, but for an international audience grounded in democratic values, individual liberty, and the rule of law, Oscar Pérez represents something deeply familiar: the lone dissenter standing against a system that had abandoned accountability. Venezuela's future remains uncertain. Its wounds are deep, but its story, and the story of figures like Oscar Pérez, stands as a stark reminder of what happens when institutions fail, dialogue collapses, and people believe their only remaining voice must be heard from the sky. In the end, the story of Oscar Pérez is not about glorifying violence or simplifying a complex national tragedy into a single figure. It is about recognizing that, at certain moments in history, ordinary individuals are forced to make extraordinary choices. Choices shaped by collapsing institutions, silenced voices, and the belief that remaining passive is no longer morally acceptable. Seeking freedom is never an abstract idea. It is lived through difficult decisions, personal sacrifice, and the willingness to confront overwhelming power. Figures like Oscar Pérez remind us that history is not shaped only by governments, armies, or ideologies, but by individuals who decide to resist when systems fail them. Acknowledging these actions does not require agreement with every method, nor does it demand blind admiration. It requires context, critical analysis, and an honest effort to preserve historical memory. Because when dissent is erased or distorted, future generations lose the ability to understand how and why societies break. In a world where narratives are often written by those who prevail, remembering stories like this becomes an act of responsibility. Freedom is not inherited. It is challenged, defended, and, above all, remembered. And as long as these stories continue to be told, the conflict will never truly remain hidden.